Before I hand over to John, a few words about us and about him. I am Meral Kaufmann, Program Lead of Chance Digitalität. We are a program dedicated to strengthening evidence-based decision-making in the education sector, and our program is run by Staatslabor and fully funded by the Jacobs Foundation. Chance Digitalität promotes the use of data and evidence for informed governments through a range of activities, amongst them this webinar today. And all of them are based on the conviction that this leads to a better policy making and better decisions in education. And that brings me, if I dare say so, to our ally from the UK and guest today. I'd like to quickly read you a quote that I found on the Education Endowment Foundation's website. It says, "We believe the best way to improve teaching and learning is to make sure that the education sector has trustworthy and actionable information about how to boost outcomes. This is why we're evidence obsessives." John Kay is one of those obsessives. He is head of evidence synthesis and international at the Education Endowment Foundation, short EEF. He is responsible for the evidence synthesis work at the EEF, including the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. This is an evidence portal that is used by 70% of school leaders in England, so quite a lot. John also has been at the EEF for quite a while, since 2014, and in a number of roles, including leading the policy team and the publication of evaluation reports on EEF-funded randomized controlled trials. He will tell us more about this in just a second, I'm sure. We're very happy to have you with us today, John, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's lovely to be here today to talk a little bit about the work of EF. I'll just get my slides up. Brilliant. So hopefully everyone can see those slides. And what I'm going to talk about in the presentation is really a case study of embedding evidence use. So all of this comes with the caveat that this is an example taken from the English school system. There are bits that hopefully are applicable. There are lessons learned that we think are generally useful across education systems, but as with anything in education, context is incredibly important. And so there are things that may be really distinct to the English education system that have really had an impact on the way that our approaches have evolved at the EEF. And so today what I'll do briefly is talk a bit about what the EF is, our background in England, and then I'm going to run through these three big challenges and how we go about solving them. So firstly, about building evidence where it doesn't exist. Secondly, about making that evidence accessible. And thirdly, and most importantly, how we move from people just accessing evidence to actually using evidence. And that's where I'll draw upon two distinct case studies. One about how we might pull policy levers to embed evidence in policy reforms, and then a second on working more directly with schools themselves when it comes to evidence use. But as I said, context is really important, and the context that the EEF came to existence in is education in England in 2011. And lots of these characteristics might be common to lots of education systems, but there are a few things that I do like to draw out when talking about the EEF. So we're a relatively young organisation, having started in 2011. But when we were first started, there'd been these sudden policy reforms which had led to an increase in school autonomy. So a big mantra of policymakers at the time was, we trust schools. We're going to let schools make the decisions when it comes to pedagogy and teaching and most elements of curriculum, in fact. And that was really sudden. A lot of that happened basically overnight, that schools went from a world in which they were provided a lot of support, maybe a lot of control, to a world in which they had a lot of autonomy. But of course, autonomy is only useful if you have really high quality information to support you in making those good decisions. And that wasn't really what was the case in England in 2011. So we had lots of people willing to sell things to schools, but we had very few studies with rigorous methodologies for measuring the efficacy of the things being sold to schools. So, by our count, we think there are fewer than five randomized control trials in England. Also, relatively few quasi-experimental designs. Most evidence was brief kind of surveys or opinions of the impacts of things rather than things that really measured impact. Um, when research did happen, it was mainly available in academic journals, and most of those journals were paywalled, and it was written in academic language. It was very much researchers talking to researchers rather than researchers talking to schools or policymakers. And there was skepticism over whether this could ever change. So lots of people said RCTs are not possible in the English education system. We frequently heard schools will never agree to be randomized. It's unethical to do a randomized control trial in the education system. And all of those things together meant that evidence wasn't frequently used in decision making. And it didn't look like it would ever be the case that it could be frequently used in decision making. And all the while, we have this other problem, which is similar in many education systems, which is the equity gaps within the English education system. So that chart on the right shows the equity gaps between socioeconomically disadvantaged peoples and their more affluent peers. Um, and the really depressing thing that happens in the English education system is it grows. So there is a gap at the very beginning, that bottom green chart in the early years. Then when you go into primary or elementary school, that gap gets wider. And then by the end of secondary school, that gap is at its widest. We'd hope that where the state intervenes and provides support, that inequities should decrease or at least remain constant. But sadly, this isn't the case in the English education system. And so, into this context, we were formed, the Education Endowment Foundation, and we were funded by the Department for Education. So, we are an independent charity, but we were formed by the Department for Education as an independent charity. So, we were given an endowment and we were given this role of being the evidence organisation in the English education system, along with enough funding to do our key activities. Um, and at the same time, we were part of what's known as the What Works network in England, which was this growing number of organisations that are focused with using evidence to solve either policy or practice challenges. And that goes all the way from evidence-based organisations in healthcare to challenges like homelessness, all the way through to many that focus on young people, ourselves included. Um, and the three key activities that the Education Endowment Foundation does that I'll talk about a little bit today are evidence generation. So, how do we build the evidence base? How do we create studies that answer the questions that matter to teachers, to school leaders, to policymakers? Evidence synthesis. So that's my job title, but it focuses really on how do we summarize the evidence that's out there? How do we make it accessible to teachers and school leaders so that rather than relying on the opinion of the teachers in their schools, they have access to all of the research that has taken place? And then finally, and I think the hardest of the three challenges, how do we mobilize evidence, or how do we ensure that evidence is actually used to change lives? Because it's all very well having wonderful, rigorous studies, but if those equity gaps that I talked about still exist in the English education system and behaviours don't change and outcomes don't change, then we haven't really done what we were set up to do. And so that's a bit about the background of EF. And really, what we're trying to do is solve those problems that I talked about on the first slide. So, problem one, not enough evidence. And the bulk of our endowment is really trying to solve this problem. So, a very common circumstance in the English education system is you have a teacher that has identified a challenge that they're facing, and they have two different solutions, and they don't know which of those solutions they should choose. And the types of things that the decision might have been made on in 2011 is which of those solutions has the best marketing team? Which is best at reaching out and telling you that their solution is going to be best? Or which is the one that you know a teacher that's done it in the past and they said that it was a good solution? And so what we do is we test the two solutions and we try and give teachers the information they need to make a decision about them. And we test the solutions with the most rigorous possible methodologies. So we take a group of intervention schools, normally around 100 schools, a group of comparison schools, and we give the intervention to the intervention schools and then compare the results at the end of the study. And typically, whether you're in intervention or control group will be randomized between the schools. And all of the studies are published. They're all published in plain language, regardless of whether the result is positive or negative. And they're all mixed methods. So they all contain not just an effect size and an impact evaluation, but also a qualitative evaluation of how and why things have been effective or ineffective. And what that means is that teachers can be empowered. So I really like the example on this slide, which is two programs which on the face of it look really, really similar. So both of them are early language intervention programs. Both of them try and boost the language skills of young people. Um, both of them have been developed by very respectable academic teams, one from the University of Oxford, one from University College London. Both interventions cost around the same amount. Um, but if you look at the one on the left, actually, the people that received that intervention did marginally less well than the students in everyday teaching conditions or business as usual. Whereas the intervention on the right, Nuffield Early Language Intervention, the pupils made 4 months additional progress versus business as usual. And that really exemplifies how providing information can leverage a large amount of funding and mean that it's used more effectively. So without actually increasing the budget spent on early language, a school moving from early to Nuffield Early Language Intervention could give their pupils 5 additional months progress for the same cost versus the 4 months versus the -1 month. Um, and of course, when you get a positive result like that Nuffield Early Language Intervention, the challenge then is how you scale that up. That's available to as many schools as possible. And the EF evidence generation pipeline goes all the way through cultivating innovation in settings, so in a small number of schools or settings, all the way through to scaled solutions going to more than 100 schools. And the idea being that you don't just need information, you need the capacity in the system that it doesn't matter whether you're in London or a big city like Manchester, or in a rural school in the countryside, you should have those effective approaches available to you. So as we scale and test things in a larger number of settings, we also bring those programs to a larger number of schools and mean that it's available and there's system capacity to deliver evidence-based approaches. Um, and of course, we don't just test programs, we test a whole variety of questions that might be relevant to teachers and school leaders. Everything from um, does giving pupils financial incentives increase their attendance at school, to should I start my lesson with a quiz or a lesson recap? And the aim is that all of our research projects deliver actionable insights that are aimed at teachers, school leaders, and policymakers rather than at an academic discussion in a journal. So everything is available, everything is published in plain language. So of course that hopefully begins to solve that problem of there not being enough evidence. We can boost the number of studies, we can build an evidence base, but that doesn't solve the problem of the limited access to evidence that does exist. And so evidence synthesis, the piece of work that I lead at the EEF, aims to make evidence accessible to everybody. And this key challenge of how do we summarize evidence in a way that is trustworthy, accessible, and actionable for practice? And there are two challenges to solving this problem. The first one is the one I've talked about a lot already. The evidence that exists is really hard to access. So teachers often don't have access to academic journals. When they do, academic journals are not written in a way that is directed and targeted either at policy or at practice. And the second risk is that evidence can be cherry-picked to introduce bias. So if there are 50 studies, then you're much more likely to choose the two studies that conform with your pre-existing beliefs and just give you a justification to do what you were always going to do. So evidence isn't actually changing your behavior. It's just being used to justify behavior you were always going to do. My favorite example of this comes a lot in the reporting in the health literature. So very frequently you'll see these two completely conflicting news stories on websites. Red wine wards off or protects against lung cancer, or cancer risk even from light drinking. And what most people do is they typically read the one they quite like and decide they'll continue to drink red wine, and maybe ignore the one that has the less appetizing conclusion for their particular lifestyle. And so we in education try and get around this similar problem. Um, and so what I try and communicate on this slide is this is every study that's taken place focusing on how to give feedback to a child in a school setting. Now, no teacher in the world, no policymaker in the world has time to read all of those 200 studies, even if they are able to get access to them, even if they have the research skills to interpret them. The time that professionals and policymakers have to actually read the individual studies in the evidence base is limited. And so what we try and do at the EEF in our evidence broker function is to summarize the evidence. And we are the people that go and read all of those individual studies, but then we systematically analyze the evidence to produce accessible summaries so that teachers can draw on the insights from those 200 studies without needing to read each of them individually. And so our teaching and learning toolkit tries to summarize the evidence for 30 different pedagogical approaches and provides information on how expensive it is, information on how secure the evidence is, and information on how impactful the approach is. So you can see with feedback, it's a really high impact approach. We get 6 months progress, it's very cheap to deliver. But then, really importantly, rather than just giving those headline findings, we also tell teachers what exists behind those average impacts. So, effects being high across all curriculum subjects where there are differential impacts in maths or English, we would highlight that to schools. But also showing that actually it seems more effective in primary school than in secondary school, although pretty effective in both. And I think a really interesting finding from feedback, particularly at the moment, is that digital feedback, while being very positive, seems less effective than when feedback is delivered by a teacher. So interesting there. Obviously, as AI develops, maybe that gap will gradually close. But in the existing evidence base, it seems like having the teacher giving feedback leads to a slightly higher impact overall. And so the teaching and learning toolkit summarizes the evidence across those 30 different topic areas. And inside this tool, in the back end of the tool, there's a summary of over 5,000 different studies. And the aim is it's a living resource. So as new studies are published, they get added to the evidence summaries. And that body of evidence is there and accessible both for policy and practice to draw from whenever they need to. So really important way of people having access to the evidence base. But now to the case studies, and I think the hardest bit of the challenge, which is it's all very well having the evidence. It's all very well having evidence that is really accessible to policymakers and teachers, but that alone won't be enough to change the behaviours of individuals. And so when we talk about evidence mobilization, we try and engage in as many levers as possible to try and change behaviours and support best practice and support people to really go from data and evidence to good practice um, in the communities that they work in. And what I'm going to do is draw on two particular case studies and talk about how we've done that, one in a policy setting and one in more of a kind of a community school to school setting. So first I'll talk about the policy engagement work and then I'll talk about the combination of accessible resources and communities of practice. Um, and so the first case study is about how we've embedded evidence in policymaking in England. And I think this is a really nice example of how policymakers, evidence or researchers and practice can work in tandem to try and build sets of standards and build high quality practice into school systems. So around 5, 6 years ago now, the Department for Education in England decided that they were going to do some reforms around teacher training. And what they set out to do was say, we need a minimum standard of evidence-based practice that every teacher is not only taught as they enter the profession, but is supported to develop as they progress through the profession. So we have a series of different teacher training curriculum that have been centralized through government. Now, universities, training providers have complete freedom to deliver other things that they want. They can add things, but the minimum standard has to be there. And the expectation from the Department for Education is that there are certain things that we would hope that every teacher knows in order to be doing evidence-informed practice. Um, and on this slide is an example that comes from a maths-specific one, where we talk about things like retrieval of factual knowledge or the way that we develop fluency in algorithms. Um, but of course, doing something like this can be incredibly politicized incredibly quickly. So if we had one government saying, here's what all teachers need to know, the next government coming and saying, actually, we disagree, they need to know this, this, and this, then that would be incredibly unhelpful for the teaching profession because you'd very quickly have different cohorts of teachers that had a completely different knowledge base that they were drawing from in their practice. And so what the government decided to do was try and make this independent. So the EEF is an independent charity, and we are known for the transparency of our methods and our rigorous methodology. And so we essentially played a role where we quality assure these frameworks before they're published. So we will sit in the room with the Minister for Education and say, we don't think that this element is evidence-based, and so it needs to be removed. And at that point, the minister has a decision they can make. They can either go ahead with their version of the framework and have it published anyway, but without the EF endorsement, or they can agree to the changes we suggest and have this stamp of approval on the framework, which says that it's been independently assessed and endorsed by the Education Endowment Foundation. And what was really heartening was the minister chose the latter of those two approaches. And the reason they did so was because they would prefer a framework that has longevity in the system and that has genuine buy-in and is independent versus a politicized curriculum which just keeps changing in every political cycle. And so it's a really nice example of how embedding evidence and having a fully referenced framework that has been independently quality assured by an evidence-led organization is not only good for evidence-based practice, but it's actually good for policy making because it leads to those reforms having a longevity that they otherwise wouldn't have done so. And so it's a really nice example. It's also a nice example of how evidence can be embedded in systems regardless of whether the teachers, the school leaders themselves care about evidence. So every teacher now in England is trained using versions of these frameworks. And what that means is they may not know that the reason they've learned how to do effective feedback is because it's been endorsed by evidence or randomized control trial. It's just part of the standard infrastructure and system within the English education system now. Um, and of course, we work with policymakers in lots of different ways. One of the ways that I'll talk about less is the scaling and funding of programs. But just to flag that first example that I gave of the Nuffield Early Language Intervention program, the one that was so positive, actually, once we found those positive results, the Department for Education then subsidised that programme into schools to provide an additional incentive for schools to do that evidence-based practice over alternatives in the system. So once again, you have these nice synergies of evidence providing a knowledge base that allows policymakers to work in a directed way to build system capacity. The second case study I think is the kind of the messier one, but the more exciting one. And this is, how do you get school-led research use? How do you get schools to not just do things because government says they're doing it, and not just to read a resource and then act upon it, but how do you support schools to build that professionalism and use of research into everyday decision making? Um, and so part of that is obviously the creation of accessible resources. So the poster on this slide is a, f- a bit of guidance that EF put out on how to improve feedback. And it summarizes some practical things that any school might want to do in order to do feedback effectively. So things like considering the timing of feedback and focusing on actionable next steps for people to take forward after receiving feedback. And carefully thinking about the balance between written and verbal feedback in the classroom. Um, and so all of these resources are based on a systematic research process that gives really rigorous recommendations to teachers, but it's all then translated into resources that we hope are really actionable. And when it comes to this guidance, we also go through co-construction, similarly to the way we worked with policymakers on those frameworks. We work with teachers and school leaders to work out, how do you combine that rigorous evidence with the day-to-day realities of teaching to provide recommendations that are genuinely actionable? So we hold a panel process where we bring the researchers together with teachers and we run through a series of questions before we make any kind of recommendation. So we have some questions that really draw from the research itself. Is the approach effective? Are there any risks or kind of downside impacts to doing the approach? How rigorous is the evidence base? But then we also have a series of questions that are really important to come from the insights of the profession. So, do you see any risks around equity here? Is this going to be feasible for schools to deliver? Um, is this actionable and acceptable in a school context? And so, when promoting the production of school-led resources, it's all about how you co-construct and bring together that research community and that rigorous evidence base with the professionalism and insights from teachers that will often need to overrule the research in order to create guidance that is genuinely applicable in a school context. And we work really hard to think about how we work with the profession to create really actionable resources. So this is a really nice example that draws on case studies on how to do professional development around metacognitive practice. And what we do here is we create a reflection resource that goes through different steps that are part of high quality professional development, but then have real exemplification from schools that have been enacting these things in order to make them accessible to schools or school leaders enabling practice. Um, and one of the things that we've tried to do to build that school to school research use pathway is we now actually fund and support a network of what we call research schools across England. And the aim of research schools is rather than the lines of communication always being government to school or organisation like EF to school, we think that knowledge spreads through a system, often most effectively through schools talking to other schools or teachers talking to other teachers. And in each research school, we fund the equivalent of a full-time member of staff whose job it is to engage other schools in their region in using research. And the really powerful thing about this model is rather than it being an abstract example from a research paper of this school did this, you can see a school in your local community genuinely embedding and exemplifying the principles that have been drawn from rigorous research in a way that you can learn from, you can challenge, you can question, you can engage from. Um, and so the research schools, as well as identifying new prospects for research and effective practice that might go through our research pipeline, provide this really important role of training schools in their region in evidence-led approaches, sometimes through twilights, sometimes through much more prolonged engagement in the system. And we go through a really rigorous process in selecting schools to be research schools. And we are um, really supportive in building their capacity, but we're also quite demanding in expecting that they're not just then using those research techniques in their own school, but their incentives are changed to be really collaborative with the schools that exist in their region. So we have 33 research schools that exist across England, but they engage with thousands and thousands of schools across the country in spreading that best practice. Um, and so that case study of those communities of practice really show the importance of co-construction, but I think really importantly that positive tension between rigorous evidence and the professional expertise that goes alongside it. One thing I wanted to talk about, though, is something that underpins both of those case studies, which is this theory of evidence use that needs to not be top down. Um, and so one risk of any evidence-informed or data-led approach is you get a world in which it goes, EF says do this, and schools end up doing things that may be evidence-based, but not because they want to do them or because they're appropriate to their context, but because it's seen as a top-down initiative. And that can be particularly risky when you have things like government reforms that are based on evidence-based policy. And so, both with the research schools and in some of the training that's provided through government, we try and emphasize this principle of good implementation, which doesn't start with being told what to do, but starts with a process that is school or policymaker led. Um, so lots of people talk about implementation at the moment. It's a real popular buzzword across lots of different sectors. When we talk about implementation, we mean three different things that exist together. So one is a process for utilizing evidence. Another is a set of contextual factors that need to be considered. And a third is a set of behaviors that underpin good implementation. So first to talk briefly about the process, um, rather than starting with a piece of evidence, we encourage schools to start with what are the problems that they want to overcome? What are the challenges that their students are facing? What is the available data that they have that highlights maybe there's a real challenge around student attendance? Maybe there's a challenge around early numeracy skills. But it's only once they've identified the challenge that they should come to the evidence. It's the second part of the process. And so then they need to go through a process of exploring what are the appropriate pieces of evidence that solve the challenge that I have in my school. But even then, once they've been through that process, it isn't time to deliver the intervention immediately, Instead, they need to think about how do I prepare to deliver an approach in a way that is appropriate? And that's where these other factors come in. So things like engaging with members of staff so that they can shape what happens, things about uniting teachers around what's being implemented. A key thing that causes evidence-based interventions to fail is often not having sufficient buy-in, but also having time to reflect and monitor and adapt as you go through the implementation process is really important. And then similarly on the contextual factors, what are the systems and structures that need to support the things that we're doing? And who are the people that enable change in this case in the school? Then and only then that preparation phase has been complete, we might move to delivering an approach. And of course, even once you've delivered the approach, implementation isn't over because another key place where evidence-based practice or evidence-based approaches fail is not being sustained. A really common risk that we see is schools each year try and do a new evidence-based intervention and stop doing the thing that was exciting 12 months ago, even if it was working. And of course, it's important to reflect and think whether these things are working. But a world in which you try and do a new thing every year, or sometimes three or four new things every year, and don't sustain the good pieces of work that you're doing, isn't a world in which you're actually going to have that prolonged and sustained positive change. And so, whether it's the research schools working with schools around this implementation process, or it's how we train schools and school leaders to consider implementation, so these key principles are embedded in every single one of the government's training curriculum, trying to move from a world in which evidence is just doing what you're told or doing what the research said to a considered process that thinks about context, behaviors, and a process for embedding evidence is a really key message that we give to whether it's policymakers or schools. So before we move to questions, a couple of final thoughts and reflections. Um, One is that this is becoming a global movement. So, um, obviously contexts are really different, but there are now a number of different organizations across the world that are thinking about what does it mean to have a go-to place for evidence in a system. And so we, in a network called the Evidence for Education Network, partner with organizations and share learnings around what does it mean to do this stuff in a way that is context specific. So each organization has a very different theory of change, but you all draw from similar principles of wanting to create a good evidence base, summarize it, and then consider how to mobilize evidence appropriately in our context. Second key reflection is that the evidence use requires national and international infrastructure. So, on the left, you can see this kind of global piece of the network that I talked about and some of the shared standards or peer learning or bits of methodological innovation. Then we have the national infrastructure. We have to the right, the messy world of teaching and everything we're trying to do in the classroom. And then in between, we have the EEF trying to do the synthesis, the generation, and the mobilization. And in between the evidence base and teaching, there are all sorts of levers that exist in these complex national systems. So maybe it's just we find a positive result and we try and scale it, like the case of Nuffield's early language intervention. Maybe it's just making the evidence base accessible for teachers to read and get access to plain language summaries of the evidence. Maybe it's embedding evidence in policy reforms, like the training reforms that I talked about in case study one. Or maybe it's building new infrastructure that supports schools within their local communities, like the Research Schools Network. But the journey is always messy because it always exists in a complex system, and it's never going to be as simple as a researcher just saying to a school, here's a good finding, you should do it. it all needs to take into account that combination of professionalism, system barriers and enablers, and a complex theory of change around how to support teachers. Um, and then finally, just returning to those challenges in England that I talked about at the start of the presentation. Now, I'm not going to claim we've solved all of them, but we are beginning to make really good progress. So moving from that world in which schools weren't accessing research to 70% of senior leaders using the toolkit directly, moving from a world in which um, you know, academic research was not appealing, it was hidden behind paywalls, to a world in which, in the pandemic, 90% of primary schools reported finding EEF resources useful based on government survey data. That was ahead of any of the other system actors. So it was ahead of the government guidance on how to respond to the pandemic. Um, and moving from a world in which we were told that RCTs and this kind of impact research would never be possible in English education, to a world in which actually over half of the schools in England have now been involved in an EEF-funded randomized control trial. So we're definitely still on a journey, but real positive signs that it is possible to build these systems of rigorous evidence use that can support the profession. And that's where I'll stop.